Wars over land, over resources, over pride. History is full of them. They erupt, they burn, and eventually they fade. Yet when the motive is religious, something changes. The rules bend, the cost stops mattering, and even after centuries, the embers never truly cool. So why is that? Why do conflicts tied to religion seem immune to the natural lifespan of other wars? To answer that, we need to look past the headlines, past the old stories of crusades and jihads, and dig into what makes belief systems so different from political systems, or economic ones. A political ideology can shift when a government changes, an economic model can collapse when markets fail, but a sacred truth, that doesn't just vanish when circumstances change. It's built to resist, to endure, to make compromise feel like betrayal. When someone's worldview is anchored to a divine command, what happens if they bend the rules? They risk not just losing a debate, they risk their soul. That kind of pressure doesn't exist in most other conflicts. Now think about the nature of truth claims in religion. They're not provisional, like scientific theories. They're not negotiable, like trade deals. They're absolute, eternal, non-negotiable. And when two sides hold different absolutes, there's no middle ground that satisfies both. If one faith says salvation comes through their prophet, and another claims the same, what room is there for peaceful coexistence when the stakes are eternal life or eternal damnation? These aren't just policy disagreements, they're cosmic ultimatums. This is why religious wars don't just destroy bodies, they consume identities. People can abandon an empire or a king and live to see another day. But to renounce a divine order, that's like erasing who you are. It's why religious conflicts often turn so personal, so total. They're not about taking land, they're about taking meaning. And meaning is something humans will die for before they'll surrender. History illustrates this brutally. The 30 Years' War in Europe, sparked by Catholic and Protestant rivalries, lasted so long and claimed so many lives that entire regions were emptied of people. Entire villages vanished. And what was it over? Different interpretations of the same sacred book. If religion were just a veneer for politics, as some argue, then peace would have come faster, deals would have been struck. Instead, the war dragged on until exhaustion forced both sides to compromise. A compromise they hated and only accepted because survival left no choice. Fast forward to the present. We like to think humanity has moved past this. After all, we have international law, global trade, diplomacy. And yet, faith-driven violence persists. From sectarian bloodshed in the Middle East to Hindu-Muslim clashes in South Asia, from Buddhist extremism in Myanmar to Christian militias in parts of Africa, the pattern holds. Modernity hasn't cured it because the root problem isn't modern. It's baked into the psychology of belief. Why does faith hold this power? Because belief systems offer something nothing else does: ultimate certainty. If you truly believe you have the answer to life's biggest questions, then anyone who challenges that answer becomes more than a rival. They become a threat to the very foundation of your reality. And here's the paradox: religions teach compassion, forgiveness, peace. But they also teach that rejecting the faith leads to ruin. When the highest good is tied to conversion or obedience, violence becomes easy to justify as an act of love. Killing the heretic, saving his soul. Burning the village, spreading divine justice. The cruelty wraps itself in virtue. And this brings us to the psychological hook. Humans crave meaning, and religion delivers it in bulk. It doesn't just answer what's true, it answers who we are and why we matter. Strip that away and people feel naked in a universe that doesn't care. That's terrifying. So when a competing belief threatens your sacred narrative, it's not just an argument, it's an existential attack. And what does species do when their survival feels at stake? They fight hard. This explains why even in secular societies, religious identities don't disappear, they just adapt. They move into politics, into culture wars, into education systems. And when those identities feel cornered, they can ignite with the same old fury. It's why the phrase religious war isn't a relic of history. It's a headline waiting to happen. Again, when we talk about religious wars, we often picture ancient armies clashing with swords and banners. But the truth is, the battlefield today looks very different. It might be a city torn apart by car bombs, a school targeted because of what children are taught, or an entire population uprooted because they follow the wrong god. The tools change, but the underlying logic remains the same. If your worldview is sacred, compromise feels like sin. One reason these conflicts endure is that religion isn't just a set of ideas, it's a tribe. It's family, community, history, and often national identity rolled into one. When you attack someone's faith, they don't hear a critique of a belief system. They feel a threat to their entire sense of belonging. And social belonging is a survival instinct. Humans evolved in tribes, and tribes defend themselves at any cost. So religious conflicts are rarely about doctrine alone. They're about defending the people who share that doctrine. That makes it even harder to untangle belief from bloodshed. Now consider this. Every religion teaches that it holds the ultimate truth. That's not arrogance. That's the point of religion. If all paths were equal, there'd be no reason to convert, no reason to preach. But when two groups each claim a monopoly on truth, coexistence is fragile. Tolerance is possible as long as both sides feel safe. But introduce fear, economic instability, political chaos, demographic change, and suddenly, tolerance cracks. Fear makes people cling tighter to what feels unshakable, and nothing feels sturdier than a divine promise. You can see this pattern in countless flashpoints today. In Nigeria, Christian and Muslim communities share land, but when resources grow scarce or politics heat up, old suspicions ignite into violence. In Sri Lanka, Buddhist nationalism fuels hostility against Muslims, despite Buddhism's reputation for peace. Why? Because when identity is sacred, even a rumor feels like a mortal threat. And technology has made this worse. In the past, rumors died slowly. Today, they spread online in seconds, inflaming millions before anyone can check the facts. Some people argue that religion isn't really to blame, that these wars are about politics or economics, and faith is just an excuse. There's some truth there. Power-hungry leaders have always exploited belief. But ask yourself, why does religion make such an effective weapon? Because it taps into emotions that no political slogan can match. It gives hatred a halo. When a cause feels holy, ordinary limits vanish. No treaty, no negotiation, no live and let live feels acceptable when the goal is divine victory. That's why leaders choose religious rhetoric, because it works. Another reason religious wars linger is the promise of reward. If you think dying in battle earns you paradise, or killing an infidel earns divine favor, then violence isn't just justified, it's sacred duty. Secular armies fight for land, wealth, survival. Religious fighters believe they fight for eternity. How do you negotiate with that? How do you sign a peace deal with someone who thinks compromise equals damnation? You can't, not easily. This isn't just theory. Look at ISIS. Their vision wasn't about building a normal state. It was about fulfilling prophecy, ushering in an end times battle. That's not a political project, that's a cosmic drama. And when the stakes are infinite, what's a human life worth? Nothing. Everything becomes expendable in service of the eternal script. Now, here's a deeper layer, one people rarely talk about: cognitive dissonance. Most believers aren't violent, they don't want to kill, but when their sacred texts or traditions justify aggression, they face a mental fork in the road. Either reject those teachings, which threatens their identity, or find a way to rationalize them. So, they frame violence as self-defense or as a tragic necessity. The mind bends reality to preserve faith, and once that mental loop kicks in, it can legitimize horrors that would otherwise feel unthinkable. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, bending logic to protect core beliefs. And nothing is more core than the belief that your faith is good. So when faith and morality clash, morality gets rewritten. That's why atrocities can coexist with sermons on compassion. It's not hypocrisy. It's survival of the sacred narrative. Here's the question. Could education solve this? Could exposure to science and reason dissolve these conflicts? History gives a bleak answer. Education can reduce fanaticism, yes, but it can also arm extremists with new tools. Look at modern propaganda, polished videos, social media campaigns, encrypted apps. These aren't medieval tactics, they're cutting edge. Faith adapts to every era because it doesn't depend on ignorance alone, it depends on identity and fear. And those run deeper than facts. This brings us to another under-discussed point, the illusion of progress. We assume humanity is on a steady march toward secular harmony, but history isn't linear. When societies feel stable, religion softens. When they feel threatened, it hardens. Economic crisis, climate disaster, mass migration, these stressors are coming, and with them, the old patterns return. Every time the ground shakes, people reach for the sacred. And every time they do, someone decides the only way to defend their truth is through force. When you study history closely, you see cycles, not straight lines. The Reformation led to bloodshed in Europe, but centuries later, those same lands became the cradle of Enlightenment thought. Then look at the Middle East, once a center of scientific brilliance, now riddled with sectarian wars. What changed? Not human nature, just the balance of power and fear. That's the uncomfortable truth. Religious violence doesn't disappear, it hibernates. It waits for cracks in the social order, then comes roaring back under a new name, in a new costume. Here's something else most people miss. Religion shapes memory. A political defeat can be forgotten. A religious wound becomes a sacred grievance passed down for generations. Ask anyone in the Balkans why old wars still haunt new politics, or why the Sunni-Shia split born in the 7th century still bleeds today. These aren't just historical facts. They're living narratives kept alive through ritual, scripture, and myth. When a community believes its suffering has divine significance, it doesn't fade, it calcifies. And vengeance dressed as justice becomes holy duty. What about dialogue? Interfaith conferences, peace summits, declarations of tolerance, they sound promising, but they rarely tackle the root issue, exclusivity. As long as religions teach that they alone hold ultimate truth, peace is a ceasefire, not a solution. People will smile, shake hands, pose for photos, then go home to texts that call outsiders blind or damned. Words of unity can't erase doctrines of division, and those doctrines aren't fringe, they're foundational. Remove them, and the faith collapses. Keep them, and conflict lingers in the DNA. Now let's zoom out. Why do humans even invent gods? Because randomness is unbearable, because suffering without purpose feels like cruelty. Religion takes chaos and turns it into story. It gives death a sequel, pain a reason, and morality a cosmic anchor. That's powerful, but the cost of that comfort is tribal truth. If your story is ultimate, then every competing story is a lie, and lies, in a sacred frame, deserve more than correction. They deserve eradication. This isn't an accident, it's structural. It's baked into the logic of faith itself. This doesn't mean believers are doomed to violence. Most aren't violent at all. Most live peacefully, love their families, help their neighbors. But here's the twist. It only takes a minority to ignite chaos when the script is sacred. If 1% of 1 billion believers turn militant, that's 10 million people willing to kill for God. And because their motives feel holy, normal deterrence, law, fear, shame, barely register. How do you bargain with someone who thinks compromise equals betrayal of the divine? How do you stop someone who believes martyrdom isn't a loss but a win? Even secular societies aren't immune. Look at the rise of religious nationalism in democracies that once prided themselves on pluralism. Fear of cultural loss fuels identity politics, which morphs into a crusade to restore a sacred order. The slogans change, but the impulse is ancient: defend the holy, destroy the threat. And in a world of nuclear weapons, bioweapons, and cyber warfare, the cost of that impulse could dwarf anything in history. The apocalypse doesn't need horsemen anymore. It needs a hashtag and a fanatic with a cause. So why will religious wars never end? Because they're not just wars over land or power, they're wars over reality. Wars over who defines truth, who owns the future, who speaks for God. You can redraw borders, share oil, sign treaties, but as long as billions believe in mutually exclusive visions of ultimate meaning, the battlefield remains. Not always with tanks and missiles, sometimes with ballots, sometimes with laws, sometimes with bombs strapped under a coat, but always with the same conviction: our way is eternal, yours is error, and error must not win. Now, does this mean hope is pointless? Not entirely. Conflict can be managed, even if it can't be erased. Secular frameworks, education, and pluralistic values can create buffers that keep ancient instincts in check. But here's the catch. Those buffers require constant maintenance. They need strong institutions, economic stability, and cultural confidence. When those falter, faith fills the void. And when faith fills the void, the old game begins again. Let's end with a hard truth. Humanity's genius is also its curse. We can imagine eternity. That's what makes art, science, and love possible. But it's also what makes us kill for invisible kingdoms. So long as people crave absolute answers, there will be prophets and preachers ready to provide them, and soldiers ready to enforce them. The weapons change, the names change, the battle doesn't. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves and wiser people so full of doubts. That certainty is why religious wars will never end. Because when you're convinced that infinity is on your side, there is no cost too high, no peace too precious, and no life too sacred to sacrifice,